Hi. Can you believe that in 2017, some people still think Africa is a country? It's funny, but it's true. The representation of the African continent on a global scale has always been one-dimensional, to say the least. Impoverished, underdeveloped, and disease-ridden are some of the most common characteristics that have been used by global mainstream media to describe the African continent as a whole. Or at the very least, it's what they seem to be focusing on the most. And because it is the only way for them to visualize it, photography became a way to inform and influence the ways in which people were thinking about Africa all across the globe. The relationship between Africa and photography started during colonial times, which began towards the end of the 19th century. Back then, photography was used to describe and classify people under colonial domination, but also to record information about African architecture, art, rituals, and other cultural artifacts. And many early photographs of Africans were typed photographs, which were very similar to modern-day mugshots. And these type photographs were used as scientific evidence to prove Africans' anthropological inferiority compared to Europeans, which served as one of the justifications to the colonization of the continent. And through photography, Africa was also depicted as primitive, which served as the binary other to the West's technological evolution and development. So colonial photography took Africans' agency away from them and prevented them from being able to tell their own stories. These photographs have influenced the way people think about Africa all across the globe. And the messages communicated in these images are still considered facts by some people today. Fortunately, Africans started to take photos themselves to document their daily lives and culture. And what was previously used as a way to objectify and dehumanize them now turned into a tool that finally gave them the ability to control their own narratives. So many photographers like Malik Sidibe and Seydou Keita, among many others, have created works that depicted Africans in a more nuanced, diverse, and dignified way, which started to change the way people were thinking about the continent. Now, the internet has made it possible for many more stories about Africa to be told by many more photographers, whose work could now reach anybody in the world in a matter of minutes. This led to even more positive images of the continent to spread more easily across the globe, which changed even further their perception of Africa on a global scale. And despite certain practices and stereotypes from the colonial photography era still being reproduced to this day, African photographers, thanks to the internet, have been able to offer an alternative to this narrative by depicting an Africa that is both culturally diverse and complex. For instance, I come from Gabon, which is a small country in Central Africa I know many people have never heard of. And as a photographer myself, the internet has allowed me to show where I come from to an audience that probably wouldn't have known such a place existed otherwise. It allowed me to depict a different and maybe new side of the continent, the way I experienced it myself every day growing up. A lot of my work also focuses on highlighting the diversity in African identities and how these identities are created through the intersections of different factors like gender, culture, and even socioeconomic status. And I chose these topics specifically to show that Africa is not a monolith, and that unlike what a lot of people in the West seem to be thinking, there is not just one African identity or culture. But while I believe that it is very important to spread positive images of the continent as much as we can, I believe that it is even more important to be honest, because things like corruption, oppressive political regimes, and gendered violence are things that are still setting the continent backwards and preventing it from being able to unleash its full potential. Many photographers have used their work as a platform to start conversations around these social issues. And some have made work about the way certain African communities treat women, or LGBT communities, for instance, in the hopes of moving the collective thinking forward and changing the way we treat these marginalized communities in Africa and beyond. And on a continent where the media is very often controlled by the oppressive political regimes in power, photography also becomes a way to reestablish the truth and present events as they actually happened. For instance, presidential elections happened in my home country, Gabon, back in August 2016. And despite everything pointing out to the leader of the opposition being the winner, the government in power still won after poorly cheating and falsifying the number of votes, as they always do. And these results led to several protests across the country, which were violently received by the police, who started to shoot at the unarmed protesters. And despite the government telling both local and international news outlets that everything was fine, photography was able to show the violence that had been inflicted upon this population that was doing nothing more but asking the government to respect their votes. These photographs showed the true nature of this government to people both in and outside the country, which resulted in several protests across the globe. In several cities in France, but also in places like New York, Houston, and even Ottawa and Montreal. So photography was not only able to show the violence of an oppressive political regime, but most importantly, the strength and resilience of a nation finally standing up against oppression and violence. The way we have been thinking about Africa has been changing since the 19th century, mainly because of photography and more recently, the internet. And what was previously thought to be a primitive land is now starting to be seen as a place full of diversity and potential, with strong and resilient people fighting for what they believe is right. And one thing the colonial photography era has shown us is how easy it is to spread false narratives about an entire continent. So, in the spirit of this year's theme for the conference, let's all remember to stay open-minded and to never let the media control the way we think about certain parts of the world. Now more than ever, let's all remember that people can be as complex and layered in places like Africa and the Middle East, for instance, as they are in Europe and North America. Let's all remember to stay open-minded, because what we see in photographs is not always the whole truth. Thank you.